Okay, colleagues, the final stretch, the final argument in favor of the project of modernity, the project of enlightenment, right? So we have seen the most forceful critique of the project of enlightenment in philosophers such as Nietzsche and especially Foucault, right? And as opposed to their critical projects, right, Antonio Gramsci and more importantly Jürgen Habermas are going to try to propose that enlightenment is not a failed project but simply an unfinished project, and that there's still hope for free and equal discussion. Well, in fact, I want to say that maybe it's possible to read Foucault himself as something of a Marxist, something of a Gramscian, but that's a separate point. So let's see the layout of the battle, right? So on the one side, we have the coercive external forces that drive, competitive drives for efficiency's sake. So we have coercive laws of competition in the market, right? Capitalism, modern Western bourgeois rational capitalism, coercive laws of market competition that drive corporations and individuals towards efficiency for the sake of efficiency. And the proletariat is alienated, have to work as much as possible, be productive as possible, but the bourgeoisie also alienated because they have to be good shepherds of capital, right? On the other hand, we have coercive laws of competition between sovereign states, between nation states, right? And kind of in both of these competitions, you can see how kind of this logic, quasi-games theoretical logic, as if like a failed prisoner's dilemma game, where the individuals, individual people, individual corporations, individual states become hostages of this greater structural logic of, again, competition and therefore natural selection towards greater and greater efficiency, not humanity, not happiness, not meaning in life, but greater and greater efficiency, right? And as opposed to this, tentatively, contingently, precariously, Gramsci and Habermas are going to reaffirm the classical Enlightenment ideal of free and equal discussion, the ideal of Rousseau and General Will, or ideal of, John Stuart Mill's ideal of, again, free and equal discussion. So let us begin somewhere. So what is, especially when we talk about market competition and raison d'etat, right? This competition between states. In a very important and immediate fashion, we have to thematize the problem of imperialism. And again, our course points towards various other disciplines. So political philosophy points to philosophy of physics, to philosophy of biology, philosophy of psychology, evolutionary psychology, points to social theory. Here, political philosophy points towards international relations, theory of international relations, a wonderful course that you can hopefully can or will take at some other point in your life. So when we look at imperialism, I'm primarily talking about the new imperialism, right? I am always reminded of the two fateful dates, 1848 and 1914. So the failed revolutions, the spring of the nations of 1848, in an important sense, within this kind of quasi-Marxist analysis, it seems that once the states have chosen to suppress the drive towards free and equal discussion of the public sphere in 1848, the only road, the only way in which the drive towards democracy and greater freedom and equality might have been suppressed is through the appeal to nationalist rhetoric. And this has set the Europe towards a self-destructive path of, down the line of the First World War of 1914. And ever since, again, this failed promise of 1848, the year where Marx's overly optimistic Communist Manifesto came out, right? The failed revolutions of 1848, in some sense, you could say maybe have doomed humanity, first of all, to the destructive and self-destructive conflict of the First World War, where the youth and the color of the European youth is mowed down by industrialized, mechanized warfare, the machines and the machine guns and the tanks, right? And 1914, in an important sense, leads to the Second World War. The First World War leads to the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, and then the Cold War. So kind of, again, having chosen to suppress the spirit of freedom, humanity was forced down the path of war. The First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War. And the logic of the Cold War, importantly, has to do with this idea of imperialism, which is a certain kind of capitalist world system dominated by sovereign nation states in global capitalist competition. So again, you can see how the coercive logic of the market works together with the coercive logic of state competition, coercive logic of market competition together with the coercive logic of state competition. So the three theorists, no time to go into detail, but the three theorists whose names I just want to mention is John Hobson, not to be confused with Hobbes, John Hobson, Vladimir Lenin, and Immanuel Wallerstein, right? Kind of the idea being for Hobson and Lenin and Wallerstein, how nationalism and capitalism work together to undermine any kind of promise of real democracy. So how is this logic supposed to play out? So John Hobson, a liberal political philosopher, writing on the eve of the First World War, so before the First World War, proposes a following argument. It's kind of, again, I'm oversimplifying, but I think the main logic is clear. He talks about how you have powerful interest groups, right? And these powerful interest groups profit from colonial expansion. So we have this international oppression where the Western powers, so Hobson is writing, first of all, with respect to Britain before the First World War. So the British government and the British public spend, blood and sweat and, tears, right? They pay the taxes, they man the factories, they enlist in the army, right? In order for Britain to force itself upon its colonies. So the British public expends blood, sweat, and tears. But the colonial system, at the end of the day, does not really benefit the British public, but benefits the narrow sectional groups, the narrow sectional cliques of sort of the growing international, class of, colonialists and industrialists, right, who disproportionately benefit from this unequal system of exchange. And so you can see, right, Hobson's notion, right, that you have powerful colonial groups at home who monopolize economic power, and by deploying economic power, monopolize political power. By appealing to nationalist sentiment, block any kind of dissent. So at the end of the day, what these powerful groups do is they radically undermine democracy, and any kind of attempt to try to dislodge them from power is met by nationalist rhetoric. So if you sort of question this unequal system of colonial oppression, the response, the ideological response is you're just being a traitor. You're a traitor to the nation. You want Britain to spend less on, its, again, external coercive military force. Do you want Germany to win? Do you want France to win? So again, by appealing to nationalist sentiment, misrepresent the interests of the narrow section of the industrial monopolists as the interests of the whole nation. Again, and thereby, again, this unequal deployment of monopoly economic power reinforces the monopolization, the usurpation of political power, right? And again, undermines the democratic system at home. This is the basic argument of John Hobson, again, in a broad outline. So I'm having to rush and oversimplify through this lamentably, but hopefully the main idea is clear. Now, let's step up the level of analysis and take a step back and look at the entire system. And so we can talk about Vladimir Lenin and Immanuel Wallerstein. So both of these are Marxist philosophers. And now, especially in Wallerstein, we look at the system, world economic system as a whole. And Hobson is writing before the First World War, and Wallerstein is actually going to write during the Cold War and at the end of the Cold War, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Wallerstein actually died just recently. So this is a modern analysis of the modern economic system, presumably applicable to the world as it exists today in 2021. So what we have, and I'm going to use Wallerstein as a segue to the ideas of Antonio Gramsci. What Wallerstein is talking about, so in Marx, we had a simplistic picture, proletariat and bourgeoisie. And especially in the Communist Manifesto of 1848, we had this simplistic, optimistic picture of how, on the pain of hunger, the workers are forced to unionize across industries and across nations, and the international industrial union of workers of the world unites and overthrows capitalism. Right? But what first Lenin and then Wallerstein is going to say, it's not so simple. It's not so simple. We have the strategy, which is as old as the woods, right? Divide and conquer. Divide and conquer. Let's divide the proletariat. And again, in one sentence, why does the communist revolution fail? Nationalism. Divide the proletariat between nations, right? And more specifically, we're talking about proletarian nations of the so-called periphery in Wallerstein and the bourgeois nations of the core. So Marx had a simple picture, bourgeoisie versus proletariat. Now we have a complicated picture because you have different kinds of nations. You have capitalist nations, with high concentration of capital and capital-intensive production, and then you have proletarian nations, which lack the capital but do have the labor resources and therefore concentrate on labor-intensive production or maybe extraction of material, primary material resources, right? And so you're going to have the bourgeoisie and proletariat of the core and bourgeoisie and proletariat of the periphery. So it's not two classes anymore, but four classes. And so the situation becomes much more complicated, and the revolution, world communist revolution, becomes so much more complicated, right? And so basically the idea is that in the countries of the proletarian periphery, the vast majority of people, again, are poor. We have cheap, unskilled labor, and the predominant mode of authority, it's like the regimes are authoritarian in nature. So we have authoritarian regimes with underdeveloped institutions of civil society, with underdeveloped public spheres, right? So we have this a global international explanation for the different, political dynamic within the states. So, if the country is poor and labor intensive, then the prediction of the theory is that predominantly we're going to see an authoritarian institution with weak institutions of civil society and weak institutions of, public sphere. And so Gramsci says that in these kinds of countries, the revolution should proceed. First, you begin with the war of movement, which is to say, like a violent overthrow of the government, violent overthrow of the authoritarian illiberal government. But then, very importantly, and this is a step which is there in Marx, but Marx doesn't explain this very well. It's implicit in Marx, but it's not very explicit. The overthrow of the authoritarian institutions is not enough. You now need to build a system of, free and equal discussion. You need to build the public sphere. Again, these wonderful system of the Soviets, right? You need a proper kind of, education, consciousness, class. The proletariat as a class in itself has to become class for itself, acquire class consciousness, and develop the political institution. And this is what Gramsci calls the war of position. The war of position. Kind of, again, building up the functioning institutions of free and equal discussion, the functioning institutions of worker democracy. And in an important sense, in a nutshell, this is, if you want, in an oversimplified fashion, the course and the ultimate failure of communist revolutions in Russia and in China. Now, of course, history is a very complicated topic. I don't mean to oversimplify, but at least in its own terms, it's very clear that, again, revolution in Russia reversed in 1991, and revolution in China, more or less, also, broadly speaking, reversed, although it's a more complicated topic, right? But it's like Russian socialist experiment failed in its own terms in 1991, right? So the war of movement maybe was successful in 1917 or whenever, 1922, but the war of position was failed, right? So in an important, and there's, it seems that there is potentially some kind of a lesson here, right? That the countries of the periphery, if you start the revolution in the countries of the periphery, none of the theorists on the board actually come out and say this, but this is a potential implication, so this is my own interpretation, take it with a grain of salt. If the revolution begins in the countries of the periphery, in an important respect, the revolution is, I don't want to say doomed to failure, but it's very difficult for the revolution to succeed. So you start with a single poor country, the rest of the world is opposed to it, so the country not only has to try to build this war of position, build up the institutions of free and equal discussion and of working, functioning democracy, but also maybe fight against the external capitalist intervention, which is what happened with the nascent Soviet Russia and the nascent Soviet China. And so it's very difficult to achieve. It's very difficult to see how this is going to succeed. Not to mention that, again, you're talking about, in Russia and China, you're talking about underdeveloped civil society, mostly agrarian, mostly peasant society, right? And you have this vanguard of the party, and how can you be sure that the vanguard of the party is actually going to stay true to the ideals of the revolution, and not just, again, in this coercive laws of market competition, coercive laws of competition between states, not it's like not gonna hijack the revolutionary potential to simply enjoy quasi-feudal privileges, take advantage, hijack the ideals of the revolution for their own narrow sectional corporate interests. So, like, you can think of this maybe in terms of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, how the private or corporate interest, right, of the ruling class takes advantage of the social dynamic. So this is the proletarian side. So in an important respect, kind of the legacy of this whole style of thinking, to a large extent, especially sort of in the so-called Western Marxism, is to maybe focus on the countries of the core, advanced capitalist countries, and to ask how is revolutionary transformation or some kind of socialist transformation possible in the countries of the core.